For more than 2 decades, industrial and systems engineers worldwide have trusted FlexSim to help them analyze and improve the important systems they work on. Now that FlexSim is part of Autodesk, our commitment remains stronger than ever to provide a powerful and easy-to-use simulation modeling and analysis solution. But we're also building something better, a digital thread across your organization where connected data unlocks new workflows, enables collaboration, and allows you to leverage data from across your organization to simulate and optimize. Autodesk is here to help systems design and improvement be more impactful at your organization.
Here's the problem. Large language models are evolving so fast that even the experts have trouble keeping up. In less than 1,000 days, generative AI has reshaped how we search, code, learn, and work, all while introducing new questions and responsibilities. So how do engineers, educators, and everyday users make sense of this exponential pace? How do we prepare students when the tools they're learning with can also outsmart the exams? In this episode of Problem Solved, IISE's David Brandt talks with Dr. Joe Wilck of Bucknell University, who returns to share what's changed and what hasn't in the first 1,000 days of large language models. Together, they unpack the realities behind the hype, the challenges facing educators, and the opportunities ahead for engineers navigating LLM's next frontier. This is Problem Solved.
Joe Wilck, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. It's glad to be here.
We spoke, what was that? Fall of 23, I want to guess, on what turned out to be an award-winning podcast interview. I just like to point that out all the
time. Wow. That's great.
But we talked then about the state of generative AI, and that was about a year after the public release of ChatGPT. Our initial interview, we opened up with the suggestion that many people had taken to using ChatGPT within that first year. I gave a presentation recently at the annual conference in Atlanta. It revealed to me that I may have been very wrong about that estimate, as so many people in the room seemed to be, I won't say clueless, but certainly inexperienced. So what's your assessment today about the widespread knowledge about ChatGPT, Claude, other generative AI tools? And is this tech still new to the public in general?
So I think there's actually a lot of misnomers going on here. I remember when ChatGPT first came out, it was publicized that it was like the fastest growing technology ever in the history of mankind, even faster than the iPhone. And I think two things can be true at the same time. I think, yes, it could have been widely used and adopted kind of at a first pass, like people tried it out. And then some people might have tried it a couple of times and said, okay, I know what it is, and then just left it alone. In terms of what's going on right now, I think where we're seeing it is we're seeing it in being embedded in a lot of other products. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you use a search engine, very likely you're going to see some results that were generated by generative AI. But if you're just kind of a naive user or just a casual user of a search engine, you may not realize that something was generated by generative AI amongst all the other links that it provides you in the search engine. So I think some of that is happening kind of behind the scenes and people just are not aware of it.
Sure.
I also think that for people like me, I have an account with ChatGPT through OpenAI. I have to log in to use it. So I have to go through that step. So I'm very knowledgeable. Yes, I am now entering into this realm, entering into this software program. But for a lot of people, they may kind of have that mark of delineation and say, unless I've logged in, I'm not actually an active user. I'm just a passive user. Mm-hmm. I think sometimes people might not realize what's going on in the world around them, whether it's the browsers or the chatbots.
Sure. Well, and I think there's also still a confusion about, we use the term AI kind of flippantly. And I think there's certainly a wide degree of difference between something like Siri or Alexa, where there's a bit of pre-programming going on. They have a set of rules. There's a set of data that they work off of, whereas generative AI very much is a creation tool based on much wider set, and in terms of how it gives output, it's so radically different from just asking Siri for the weather forecast.
Right. And I like to tell people, and I'll use two terms that are very overused in industrial engineering, but some AI is just very discrete.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And what I mean by that is you ask it a question and it's going to give you the same answer every time, unless there's some kind of exception. So, for example, if you use GPS navigation on your phone, it's very likely going to give you the same direction from point A to point B every time, unless there was like a car accident or something. That's a more discrete example of AI, but that's not generative AI. That's just, we now have a computerized version of what we used to use maps for.
Right.
Okay. A more stochastic or, probabilistic is the generative AI. And in some cases, it's very casual. So you mentioned Siri or Alexa or something. If you say, "Good morning, Alexa," it'll respond back to you. It won't always say the same thing, but it'll be in the same family of responses.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the probabilistic nature of it. It's still in the same realm of an adequate response, similar to how a human would, converse with you.
We're talking on August 6th right now. That's when we recorded this, and we're about 20 days shy of the 1,000th day since ChatGPT's public release. The first year of large language models, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, highlights extraordinary change. What are some of the biggest changes you've realized in how we use large language models or the applications from others that you've witnessed?
So, 2 years ago when we talked, I kind of predicted that we would see two things happen. One thing that we would see happen would be bigger, better models, just more data that they use to build the models. So think kind of like a Jeopardy, could win in any category type of a model.
Mm-hmm.
And those models have been built. All the key players have built their version of that bigger, better, best model. Now, the other thing that I predicted, though, was that some organizations, particularly if they had the capital, would build subject matter experts. And so they would be very knowledgeable in a very niche field. And then they could then use that to sell to customers or to use it internally or what have you. And we've seen both of those things happen. Where I did not foresee what would happen over the last 1,000 days is having the different modalities.
Mm-hmm.
So you have these multimodal models. And so you have like image generation or video generation or even audio generation, and then having those coordinate with the large language model that's more text generation. And so what I didn't foresee is how all of those would start working together and progressing forward. Right now, where I've seen the biggest strides is where you're finding these very particular models or methods in these niche fields, and they're actually making those industries either better, safer, more efficient, et cetera, whatever their objective is.
Right.
To give you an example, in healthcare, there's a website called openevidence.com. And what they have done is they have gone to all of the scholastic journals in medicine, and they've gotten rights to search all these journals, and they're basically have created a subject matter expert on different health ailments. Okay. And so if you can imagine, if you're a nurse or a doctor and you have a patient, you now believe that they have a certain ailment, you can go to Open Evidence and you can type in the situation and it'll give you papers and articles and actually give you direct links. But the other big benefit is you can also use a persona with it. So you could say, okay, my patient is a teenager. Please give me some pointers for how to communicate this to a teenager. Please give me some pointers for how to communicate to their parents. Okay. And so the medical professionals can use this tool not only to get facts, to provide to the patients, but also to kind of curb the conversation in a way that will help them communicate to the patient.
That's incredibly fascinating.
Problem Solved will be right back.
Are you looking to sharpen your skills, boost productivity, or take your career to the next level? The IISE Training Center offers world-class professional development built for busy engineers, managers, and problem solvers. Whether you're diving into analytics, earning a Lean Six Sigma certification, or exploring supply chain logistics, our expert-led courses deliver practical tools with real results. Learn online or in person with options tailored to every career stage. Plus, our training works. Past participants have applied their knowledge to save their companies over $250 million in real-world projects, and 90% of Lean Six Sigma candidates pass their exam on the first try. Visit iise.org/training to explore the full course catalog and start transforming your career today.
Welcome back to Problem Solved.
You guys, though, you and your fellow researchers 2 years ago, you were running experiments yourselves on the few LLMs that existed at the time. You had each one take, I think, 3 tests and a final exam to compare to the results of your human students. And the questions, I think, were exercises and not multiple choice, if I recall. Have you since rerun that experiment? And if so, where are you seeing improvements or continued failure by the large language models?
Yeah, so most of the exercises were free form, but there were some multiple choice.
Okay.
We have rerun the experiment, and the large language models have gotten better. So that's, as an educator, that is scary
Sure.
because you're going to have to continuously make your test harder and different. So honestly, my suggestions to folks are very similar to what they were 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
If you're giving a test where students have the capability of using a computer, connected to the internet or their phone or whatever, you need to avoid multiple choice. And you need to kind of think through what are the steps that you're going to be looking for. Now, on the reverse side of that, though, it still doesn't always get the answer correct. And where it fails is, so far we have large language models, and as you said earlier, they're very good at trying to predict patterns. Well, numbers, particularly quantitative questions, it's not necessarily a pattern. It's a calculation. It's a fact. Okay. Yeah. So you take this number and add this number or multiply this number, you should get the same answer every time. And so where we do still see problems is when you have these multi-step quantitative or mathematical type questions. So you still need to work with that. One of the things that I would mention too is what we have seen differently in the last couple of years with respect to these types of questions, though, is students as well as faculty, we've gotten better at prompting. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so students, if they really are using these and they're actually trying to use them to get the answer, they can perhaps ask better prompts, and then it will lead to a better result. Or they can do what I would call a chain of thought exercise where basically you're asking the large language model to show its work. And then if you go in and you try to verify the calculation, you can see whether it got it right or wrong. But even if it got it wrong, you at least understand the concept. You're like, oh, it's trying to do this. It just didn't do whatever that was correctly.
Right.
And so the students have gotten better at perhaps prompting and oversight.
What's funny is getting it to explain its reasoning. That is where I've found even, I guess, a better sense of discovering the flaws or the hallucinations is when it really does spell out its work. And that is where I do have built-in skepticism about the ability of this tool. But having said that, had I not specifically asked for its reasoning, I feel I just would have been naive. I wouldn't have considered that possibility. But when I see it explained out, yeah, I'm like, oh no, that's not accurate, and trying to verify where its sourcing is from. I just find that to be still, I guess, a big reveal in all of this.
I agree. I think one of the things that students, as well as faculty and others that use these tools, need to remember is that number one, they're conversational agents.
Mm-hmm.
So they were designed to have conversation. And typically, at least maybe I'm amongst friends here, but typically you're not going to have like conversations about mathematical formulas and calculations, directly.
It doesn't make for the best dinner conversation. I can say that.
Right. But the other thing to keep in mind is these models were designed with an intense amount of data, and they were designed to the term is few shot learning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so if you dive into some of the research papers about few shot learning, what they're really getting at is with only one or two examples, can it pick up a pattern and then understand the pattern and articulate an answer just off of one or two examples?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what we're seeing. But in some cases, particularly early on with LLMs, now that they've built bigger and better ones, you're going to have fewer of this. Some of it was zero shot learning. Like they had no example in their corpus, but they were just going based on what they could pull from other things that were in their data set.
Sure.
So another way to really use a tool like a large language model is you give it an example in your prompt and then tell it, okay, here's what's changed. Can you rerun under these new conditions?
To that end, you had used Python, I believe, early on. Is that still been the case for you, or do you largely operate with English prompts? That sounds strange to say, but basically, are you still using more math and coding, or are you just like maybe more of a general user might be using these tools, just giving it an English command and waiting for hopefully the right response?
I use it generally, but I also use it for code as well. And what I said 2 years ago to kind of be kind of predictive and provocative, I said that English was going to be the new programming language.
Sure.
Because people were going to basically just articulate what they wanted in English, and then the LLM would generate code. Now, a couple of things made that possible. First, in their data set or in their corpus, they have a lot of Python code.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've put in Python textbooks and code, et cetera. I believe Microsoft also, under certain conditions, they were able to get access to a lot of GitHub repositories. So they were able to then flood their corpus with a lot of GitHub repositories. But with that all being said, I think to actually get the biggest benefit, you need to understand some nuances of programming languages. It doesn't necessarily have to be Python,
mm-hmm.
but you need to understand, like, say, the difference between a conditional statement and a loop.
Right.
And, what's the difference between a for loop and a while loop? And under what circumstances would you prefer to use one versus the other? So I think it's still important from a scholastic standpoint that students understand kind of these terms and what they mean, and a few examples just to kind of get them started. But with that being said, where the large language model could be very useful is in the syntax.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say something like, I need a conditional statement to do X and Y and maybe Z, and then it can provide the code that does that for you. But you as the user needed to understand that the key thing to say was, I need a conditional statement.
Right.
So I think the best way to use tools like this for coding is to not think of your code as something that needs to be done all at once, but think about it in terms of, different chunks, if you will, or different parts of it. And then, using it in an iterative fashion to build your chunks of code that hopefully you can, piece together. The one side comment to that is also this concept of vibe coding.
Right.
And that concept kind of came about earlier this year, I believe in January or February of 2025.
Sounds right.
And that is more for software developers, because for vibe coding at its core is you're changing the code that's on your screen, but it impacts code in other areas of your overall program. And the LLM is smart enough to realize if you make a change here, we need to automatically make changes here.
Right.
And to be honest, I'm typically teaching students that are only usually need to worry about what's on their screen. They don't need to worry about how it pieces together just yet. And so I think for me in teaching, I'm mostly just focused on what's on my screen.
Right.
The vibe coding is more for software development.
Gotcha. Is there a large language model or generative AI tool that has since become your default instead of the traditional Google search? Because for the last 20, 25 years, we've been Googling things.
So my Gmail account, I had to be invited to that was back when there was invitation only.
Yeah.
And so I have a Gmail account, and so I'm a big Google user, Chrome user, and so for various search things, I'm still in Chrome.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've learned, and I mentioned this earlier, is when I search for something, immediately there's that generative AI where it's trying to answer my question.
Right.
And in some cases, I'll just scroll right past that because I'm actually looking for a link.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, for basic stuff, I'm still using a search engine. And it wouldn't just be Google. I'm sure Bing, if you're a Microsoft user, does the same thing. So it's not just Google. I'm sure other search engines have a generative AI kind of built in now as well. In terms of the large language model, the two that I primarily use, I have my own personal account still with OpenAI, so ChatGPT, so I still have that. And then my university, Bucknell University, we are a Google school. And so we have Google Notebook LM. And I'll be honest, I don't use it as much as I use ChatGPT.
Mm-hmm.
But Google Notebook LM for me has been very useful for one key thing when I'm trying to put together some stuff where I have multiple files. Our account, again, through my university, we have a developer account, and I can upload, I believe it's up to 50 documents into the notebook, and then I can basically restrict it to searching just in those 50 documents, and it can reference me to the page number, or it can piece things together. And that's very beneficial because instead of searching the entire internet or the entire repository of something, I can kind of restrict it to a certain set of documents, but then still have it search. So it's basically, it would be very good in terms of like a literature review, or if you're trying to reference across multiple students' work. So that's been very beneficial. So those are the two large language models that I use most frequently: OpenAI's ChatGPT, and then the Google Notebook LM.
I have to be honest. I had to contain myself when you mentioned Notebook LM. I love Notebook LM. Honestly, I was surprised. I've come across people over the last year and a half. I mentioned Notebook LM to them, and they go, "Oh, what's that?" I'm just like, "Oh, everybody, please, let's catch up," because Notebook LM is an amazing, amazing tool for that very reason. So I'm also a big Claude user. Claude is very good for communications work, writing, editing, proofreading, especially. And I also use Gamma for presentations. Those are that's my personal AI toolkit, as it were, today. You've talked a little bit about students and how you've worked with them on generative AI. At the annual conference, I had given that presentation. A professor had asked me directly about how to prevent the students from using this tool to, cheat. Let's just flat out call it that. But basically to use it beyond the parameters of what they may be assigned to use it for. And I was honest in saying at the time, I didn't have a solution for them, but I felt that the onus is ultimately on the university or academia as a collective to provide guidance on the ethical and appropriate applications for generative AI. You've previously said that it's critical to teach students these tools, though you stress there's a difference between what they may do for an English class assignment versus what they might do for a class relative to industrial engineering. Have your views about students in generative AI evolved in the past couple of years, or have they largely stayed in that same realm?
So to use an analogy, I like to think of, red light, yellow light, green light. And if you think about your baseline industrial engineering courses, I would recommend kind of having a yellow light mentality. So, you give students boundaries, you give them, this assignment, you can use generative AI however you want. This assignment, you cannot, or you have to cite it appropriately or something of that regard. I think back to when I was in college, there were certain classes that were mathematical, but there would be strict rules. They would say, okay, on this test, we're not going to allow you to use a calculator, or for this assignment, we're not going to allow you to use a computer. But for other assignments, you were allowed to use some of those tools. And so I think generative AI will have, when you're teaching it, you can have similar restrictions. I personally have trouble thinking of a course that should be completely green light. Everything's open all the time without any type of citation. Like, I don't think we're there yet. I also don't think for at least mainstream industrial engineering courses, we should be in the red light either, where you completely restrict it all the time. I think we should be kind of operating in that yellow light mentality. Now, for other courses outside of industrial engineering, they may be in the pure green light or the pure red light mentality, but I'm speaking specifically to industrial engineering courses here. And I think this is also true even for big universities that have, hundreds of students in a class or a section. And they might be thinking, well, how do I give a paper-based test, or how do I have such and such activity without the students being able to use a computer? There are ways to do it. We were able to teach students with hundreds in the class before calculators and computers and such. So there are ways to do it. Maybe you cut off the internet, for example, or something like that. But there are ways to kind of handle that situation. So I'm in the same realm, but I do have some comments that would be useful to a faculty member, for example. So just my stump speech again, in an engineering discipline, I believe our students very likely are going to go into data-driven, engineering-driven careers. So they're going to need to know how to work with Gen AI to make their jobs more efficient and effective. However, also just as important is the critical thinking. And so a lot of courses at the university level teach critical thinking, but not necessarily from an engineering or data-driven context. So think like an English composition class. Mm-hmm. So what my colleagues in an English composition class could do is, I guess you can make it so they don't use a computer, and that's going to be really tough because class sizes are really big, and how do you grade handwritten papers?
Right.
But one of the things that I've heard of some of my colleagues doing, but it requires the students to use a particular software such as Google Docs instead of Microsoft Word. They are requiring the students to use a Google Doc, and they put in a keystroke counter. And so if you had to write 1,000 words, mm-hmm. and including editing and deleting, and you're looking at several thousand keystrokes.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. And so what professors are doing in these fields is they're using tools to measure the effort or measure the output. Again, it's still possible someone used ChatGPT to write the paper and then they typed it looking on another screen.
Sure.
But you can now at least see, did they copy and paste it from another source and it took 10 seconds versus, say, 3 hours.
Right. Whatever. Absolutely. Okay. You've also mentioned that you had talked to a number of teachers yourself from other sectors, not just industrial engineering, and they all said that they were concerned greatly about copyright law, intellectual property, so on and so forth. I think about that more and more, particularly when it comes to the level of evolution I've seen in image and video generators. Not to say that text-based copyright is irrelevant. It very much is relevant. But where I think everyone is having a little too much fun is in image and video generators. In this academic world, how much emphasis is being put on sourcing and verification and this high speed and scaling up of generative AI?
So I want to answer a couple of questions that are embedded in your question and then get to your original question.
I give you a lot. I understand.
First, I personally am also worried about copyright law. And I know the current executive administration has kind of downplayed it in the United States. However, all of these tools that we're talking about are globally used.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll see what happens in Europe, because Europe has always been ahead of the United States in terms of data privacy.
Sure.
And also cybersecurity, regulation.
Yep.
And so
GDPR for social media, for example.
Yep. So I think what's going to happen is these companies, and I'm not going to name names, but I believe they're going to have to pay a settlement to various copyright holders because they use their material to build their models. For images and video, I am very concerned about deep fakes. We are likely going to have to see ways for these AI tools to have like a digital watermark.
Mm-hmm.
And so there might be a way to kind of see a watermark to see if something is, a deep fake or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, getting back to another question you have, though, about the academics.
Mm.
In the last 2 years, all of the key journals and publication areas have put into place certain rules about the use of generative AI.
Mm-hmm.
And in almost every journal that I've submitted since, early part of 2023, there's a little commentary box that you have to kind of explain. Did you use generative AI? If so, how did you use it? Did you cite it? All that sorts of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think from an academic standpoint, we're kind of still on that honor system.
Right.
There are plagiarism checkers. There are Gen AI checkers. I'm not sure how good they are. But for the most part, we do still operate on this honor system, and we're kind of waiting for the AI checkers and the plagiarism checkers to improve.
Well, and to what you described about, how these companies use labor overseas, to me, that registers there's still a mass need for human oversight. The AI cannot necessarily check itself, or at least hold itself to the level of accountability that our legal system requires. I just don't see that we're near that point yet.
I agree. I also think that it's possible these companies are kind of foreseeing the litigation that could occur in the future.
Yeah.
And they will have a better explanation to a jury that, yes, we did have human employees checking the images to train the model.
Yeah.
And, I personally kind of think, I'm going to use the term cyborg. I personally think we're going to end up in like a cyborg situation where we'll have an AI tool check the image first.
Mm-hmm.
And then if the AI tool says that it's okay, then a human will check it for one final verification.
Sure.
And so these companies can say, yes, we had humans check these, and to the best of our abilities, we tried to eliminate as many as we could.
Right. Well, it sounds like the human in the loop debate will continue. It rages on.
Yeah.
So how is generative AI software being incorporated into industry? Are there specific industries that you can cite that are benefiting more than most? And can you give any specific examples?
So I mentioned the open evidence for healthcare. I think that's a pretty interesting tool. I also have seen them in like chatbots or when you call and you're an automated kind of situation, and you're seeing them being used more there. Where I think they're the most effective, when you call the line, you're put on hold. They'll actually ask you, would you like to go to an automated system? And if you choose to go to the automated system, you don't have to wait. what it's doing is it's reducing their number of people that actually need to speak to a human. Because some questions really are basic. It's like, what are your hours of operation?
Sure.
Those types of things can be answered by automation and AI. All right. And so what that does is it reduces their wait time. And then the people who are in the queue or the line that really do need to speak to a human, they still have to wait, but hopefully their wait time is shorter. And so I think that's where we're seeing it being used now by companies. What I'm concerned about is where we're starting to see it being used also in customer facing situations where there is no human in the loop, or the humans that are in the loop do not have the authority to make to help.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're near Atlanta, so in your backyard you got the car rental agencies at the airport that are using the tool that takes images of the vehicle as they drive it back after renting the car, and they're finding a little speck of dust and they're claiming it's a dent or something, and then the person can't make a complaint right there at the station because you have to call the corporate office.
Yeah.
And it's been shown that it's possible, like if the car was wet, like the image might look distorted because of a droplet of water, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are what concerns me, is that the human who is there physically does not have the authority to override the system.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, to that end, I'd like to go ahead and jump over to sort of speed and scale about all of this.
Okay.
From a macro view, I've continued to find it to be a challenge to anticipate what's coming next. In fact, I'm really just not even qualified to say what's coming next. I'm now browsing, daily newsletters, blogs, news sites, just to try to keep up with insights and announcements from all these different companies. How do you keep up with the fast-paced nature of this technology's evolution?
I don't. It's impossible.
Great. I think we can end it all here then.
But in all seriousness, I think I have a curiosity. And so I think, when I have the time, I'm reading up on what's going on. When I'm at conferences, I'm going to sessions, I'm learning what other people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
The papers that people were writing in 2023 are finally starting to hit the journals, because it takes a couple of years for the revision cycles to come through. So I'm starting to see some of that. But from like an industry standpoint, I heard this example from a person out of industry who's like an administrator, and they said, there's organizations out there that you can trust that have been our vendor for technical support and that sort of thing. And they're starting to incorporate AI, generative AI in some cases. And you just have to have the trust to grow with your vendor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so as they add on new things, you communicate things that you're interested in, and they go out and develop them or curate them or however they need. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to find a trusted source. And then when you have the time, you go back to the trusted source and try to catch up.
And I would argue, too, try to break free of the algorithms. In other words, don't rely solely on social media to feed you, because it's only going to react to the things that you're looking at, responding to, hitting the heart button, the like button, whichever one. Like you say, keeping up with this really is next to impossible. And because of like I just mentioned, this month alone, there's going to be so many new models released. There's going to be so much news coming out of AI, and that's not slowing down at all. So I think it'd be best also based on what your relationship to generative AI is. If that's something that you're using as a tool for your work, find the right set of knowledge that's going to help you enhance your ability to use that better to accomplish what you want to accomplish. But definitely don't give in to the algorithm if you can. And I know that's tricky because we've now been doing that for 20 years all the same. Speaking of which, job outlooks are murky right now. The different economic data that's coming in, obviously some disruption there as of late. College students on their way into the real world, the ones who just graduated, they're facing all kind of hindrances right now. Getting an entry-level job has been reported to be much more difficult because a lot of companies are shifting to leaning on generative AI or other AI technology to essentially replace what an entry-level person would have done. Now, AI is not the sole reason, but it's certainly a dark cloud in the forecast. Are our jobs in more danger now than they were 2 years ago? Or is there still a need for what we've been talking about, the human in the loop? Is automation going to convince executives that the workforce can be slashed down, which we've seen among some companies already?
So I have a macro view of this. I would argue that for thousands of years, humans have found a way to be employed in the local economy, thousands of years ago, and then now the global economy.
Sure.
And in those thousands of years, we've seen technological advances along the way. I do think our jobs will change. I do think some jobs will be eliminated, but other jobs will then be created. And I'm starting to sound like a politician, but I think
it's hard not to talk about it politically, though.
Right.
Fair about it right now.
I think the key thing, though, and realizing that perhaps the majority of our audience is like engineering leaning, since we're representing the Institute of Industrial and Systems Engineers, we have technical ability, we have the ability to continue learning, and we have to evolve and adapt. But you also, and I've told this to students my entire career, if you pigeonhole yourself to a certain region or geography, that makes it harder.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you tell me that you want to get a job in XYZ city, that may be tougher than saying, oh, I want to get a job on, say, the East Coast or the West Coast. Like if you broaden your horizons a little bit geography, then you might open up more doors. The one other caveat, and again, I'm not trying to get political here, but every 4 years when we have an election and then we bring in a new administration, or perhaps we bring in a new administration, I should say, there's a little bit of a slowdown in jobs particularly for entry level in technical fields, because you're waiting. The companies and organizations are kind of waiting to see what's going to happen.
Sure.
And so I would just let folks know what we're seeing right now may also be compounded with some of the just changes that we've seen politically.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll be honest, that happens all the time. I mean, if you think back 5 years ago, COVID. If you think back to 2008, 2009, the recession. If you think back to 2001, 9/11, there's always going to be something. But then 12 months later, 18 months later, at the macro level, we've got it figured out and we're moving forward, as an industry or as an organization or as a country.
Mm-hmm.
But that being said, the people who will most benefit are the ones who have the ability or at least the curiosity to move to a new city, or the ability to relocate, or the ability to pivot and learn something new, or go into a different industry. And so that would be my recommendation, is just try to kind of, if you're a student, educate yourself as broadly as you can. And if you're a professional, be willing to, make a pivot.
I think all that's great advice. Certainly when it comes to talking to students who are just out of school and trying to give them some sense of optimism, if the job outlook is murky right now, to say, give it some time, You're right. I mean, a change of presidential administration brings about new policies. I'm going to close. I have a couple of questions left, but I'm going to combine them into one. We've already tapped a little bit into our preferred AI platforms. Beyond your research and academic work, and I'll say this for myself as well, I do use generative AI as a sounding board, as a brainstormer. I need to think about grand ideas in my personal life. I need to think about the long term. And it helps sometimes to have somebody there to talk to. And I'm single, so I don't have anybody at home to gripe to or complain to about, like, oh, I don't know what to do next. It's nice now to have a sounding board on my computer. Are you using LLMs in a similar fashion in any way in your personal life? Are you using it to eliminate a routine or improve yourself in any way?
The straightforward answer here is I am using it more for code than I would have anticipated 2 years ago. And to be quite frank, it's because I can articulate what I want to do in a sentence or two faster than I can actually type the code.
Right.
And because of that, I can articulate what I want, hit enter, it generates the code. And again, I have enough knowledge of code to know whether what it showed me is going to work or not. And see, I think that's kind of the big benefit. When you're a subject matter expert in whatever subject you're in, you can use a large language model to generate whatever it is you need to generate. And then you can say, oh, good idea, bad idea. And see, the benefit of the large language model is you don't have to ask it for just one idea. If I worked in marketing, I could say, generate 10 slogans or something. And then it would rattle off 10 of them. And I would be like, well, these 3 are bad. This one's okay. This one's really good. And, then now I'm down to 2.
Yeah.
But it's able to generate them very efficiently, very effectively. So I've used it in areas such as that. Occasionally I'll use it with like paragraph forming. Maybe I'm writing a recommendation letter. And so I've written thousands of them and the student has given me their resume and it's like, well, how do I want to piece this together? How can I say what I've said 1,000 times before, but in a different way? So give me almost use it as like a thesaurus.
Sure.
So overall, I think if you're a subject matter expert, you can actually get some efficiencies because you know what's right and what's wrong. And so immediately when it gives you a response, you can say, oh, that's good. But in some cases, it can actually write it faster than you can type it.
Right.
Not faster than you can think it, but faster than you can type it.
Sure. Well, Joe Wilck from Bucknell University, I will be curious about where we stand 1,000 days from now. It has been an incredible first 1,000 days, and no telling what comes next.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks.
A huge thank you to Dr. Joe Wilck for joining us again and offering clear, grounded insight on how large language models are evolving. And thank you to our sponsor, Flexum, now part of Autodesk, for supporting this episode and empowering engineers worldwide with the simulation tools that drive smarter decisions and better systems. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to follow Problem Solved on your favorite podcast platform. Share this episode with a colleague. Thanks for listening, and remember, every great solution is a story worth telling.